The surveyors found the first skull in 1897 while laying pipe beneath what had been the Fairmont plantation's north pasture. 3 feet down, the limestone gave way to a void. Inside, 11 human skeletons arranged in a line, all facing west, their bones fused to the collapsed earth. The county coroner noted fractured ribs, crushed spines, hands still gripping rusted tools. No coffins, no markers, just bodies pressed into clay like fossils. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as asphyxiation and crushing injuries. Time of death unknown, but estimated decades prior. What the report didn't explain was the tunnel itself, a crude passage barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, extending 47 feet before ending in total collapse. Or why someone had filled the entrance with stones and limed earth, sealing it as deliberately as a tomb. Or why, on certain August nights, farmers still hear rhythmic scraping beneath the soil where horses once grazed. The Fairmont plantation sat on 700 acres of Virginia Piedmont, where red clay met limestone bedrock and the Rappahannock River curved through bottom land that flooded every spring. In 1859, the property housed 43 enslaved people who worked tobacco fields that had exhausted the soil 30 years prior. The big house was federal style, painted white with 4 columns and a portico that faced a magnolia-lined drive. Behind it stood the kitchen dependency, the smokehouse, the overseer's cottage, and further back, beyond a line of black walnut trees, the quarters. The quarters consisted of 8 cabins built from hewn logs chinked with clay and moss. Each cabin housed 5 to 6 people. There were no windows, only shuttered openings covered with oiled cloth in winter. Floors were packed earth, roofs leaked. In August, the interiors became ovens. In January, frost formed on the inside walls. Samuel Fairmont had inherited the property from his father in 1854. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and deeply in debt. Tobacco prices had fallen. The soil yielded less each year. Neighboring plantations were switching to wheat or selling their labor force and converting to tenant farming. Samuel needed cash, but selling people meant admitting failure. And failure meant losing standing among the planter families who still controlled Spotsylvania County politics. His overseer was a man named Virgil Thorne, 46 years old, from North Carolina. Thorne had worked on plantations across the Upper South, and he understood one truth. Fear kept people working. He carried a hickory cane and used it. He kept meticulous records of infractions. 3 lashes for talking back, 5 for slowing your pace, 10 for looking him directly in the eye. The enslaved population at Fairmont knew Thorne's patterns the way they knew weather. They understood which days his temper ran hot, which tasks drew his attention, which routes across the property he patrolled. This knowledge was survival. It was passed between people in glances, in the angle of a head, in the placement of a tool left as a warning. Among them was a man named Moses, 34 years old, born on the Fairmont property. He worked in the fields, but also had carpentry skills inherited from his father. Moses could read, taught in secret by a previous Fairmont son who died young. This literacy was hidden knowledge, dangerous knowledge, but it allowed Moses to understand bills of sale, newspapers left in trash heaps, letters inadvertently dropped. He knew the plantation was failing. He knew Samuel Fairmont was negotiating with a trader from Richmond. He knew they were running out of time. Moses shared a cabin with his wife, Ruth, 28, and their 3 children. Ruth worked in the big house as a cook. She heard things too. Dinner conversations about debt, about the trader's upcoming visit, about which workers would fetch the best prices in the Deep South markets. The thing about debt is it transforms people into mathematics. In July of 1859, the Richmond trader arrived. His name was Charles Vance, and he specialized in moving labor from exhausted Virginia plantations to the expanding cotton frontier in Mississippi and Alabama. He inspected the Fairmont workforce with the eye of a livestock dealer, checking teeth, muscle tone, disposition. He made notes in a leather-bound book. He and Samuel Fairmont negotiated in the study for 3 hours. When Vance left, he had agreed to purchase 12 people for delivery in October. The names would be announced in September. The sale would erase half of Samuel's debt and buy him another year of solvency. Moses learned this from Ruth, who had been serving coffee during part of the negotiation. That night, lying on their pallet in the cabin's darkness, Ruth whispered the names she'd heard. Her own was not on the list. Moses's was not on the list. But their eldest daughter Sarah, age 11, was. They couldn't speak above a whisper because the cabin walls were thin and terror had ears. Moses felt Ruth's hand find his in the dark. Her fingers were shaking. They both knew what the Deep South meant. Cotton, malaria, work rates that killed people in 5 years, separation from everyone you'd ever known, no chance of return. "We could run," Ruth whispered, "before September." Moses had thought about running 1,000 times. Everyone had. But running meant leaving 2 younger children behind. It meant traveling north through Virginia with bounty hunters on every road. It meant survival odds worse than staying. "There's another way," Moses said. He didn't elaborate that night, but the idea had been forming for months, ever since he'd noticed the geological survey map left on Samuel's desk. The map showed the limestone cave system that ran beneath the northern section of the property. The caves had been explored decades earlier by Samuel's grandfather, who'd hoped to find saltpeter for gunpowder manufacturing. The enterprise had failed, but the tunnels remained. Moses had found the main entrance while repairing a fence post the previous winter. It was hidden in a ravine, covered by brush and fallen timber. He'd explored 20 feet inside before his makeshift torch burned out. The tunnel ran west, toward the county road, toward freedom. Over the next week, Moses recruited carefully. He spoke to 4 men he trusted absolutely: Jacob, Thomas, William, and Henry. All were between 25 and 40. All had families. All were on the sale list, or had loved ones who were. They met in the woods after dark on a moonless night in early August. Moses explained his plan. They would expand the tunnel, working at night after the overseer's rounds. They would dig west until they passed beneath the property line. They would emerge on the far side of the county road, in the oak forest that marked free territory in their minds, though legally Virginia remained slave territory for hundreds of miles north. "How long?" Jacob asked. Moses had calculated it. The property line was roughly 200 feet from the tunnel entrance. Working secretly, moving earth without arousing suspicion, they might extend the tunnel 10 to 15 feet per week. They needed 6 weeks, maybe 7. The sale was scheduled for October 15th. They had 9 weeks. "We can make it," Moses said. Thomas, the youngest at 25, asked the question they were all thinking. What about the others? Moses had thought about this. 11 people on the sale list, 4 men here. Their families brought the number to 17. Could 17 people fit through a tunnel barely wide enough for 1 man crawling? "We take everyone who'll come," Moses said, "and we do it the night before the sale." The digging began on August 7th, 1859, 3 hours after midnight. Moses, Jacob, Thomas, William, and Henry made their way separately to the ravine where the tunnel entrance lay hidden beneath deadfall and wild grapevines. They'd smuggled tools over the previous days. A pickaxe broken from a field tool, 2 short-handled spades, a pry bar, burlap sacks for moving earth, and candle stubs stolen from the big house. The tunnel mouth was a natural fissure in the limestone, roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. The cave system beyond had been formed by water over millennia, creating passages that branched and twisted through the bedrock. Moses had chosen the westernmost passage, the one that seemed to run most directly toward the county road. Thomas carried the first candle inside. The passage descended slightly, then leveled. The air smelled of wet stone and mineral deposits. 20 feet in, the natural cave ended at a wall of packed clay and fractured limestone. This was where human work would begin. They worked in shifts, 2 men digging, 1 hauling earth in burlap sacks, 2 resting. Every 10 minutes they rotated. The limestone here was soft enough to break with the pry bar, but the clay above was dense and heavy. They shored the ceiling with salvaged boards as they advanced, creating a crude framework to prevent collapse. The mathematics of excavation were brutal. Each foot of tunnel required removing roughly 7 cubic feet of material. That material had to be carried to the ravine and scattered to avoid detection. Working in near total darkness, in a space too small to stand, with tools designed for other purposes, they might advance 2 feet in a night if conditions were favorable. By dawn on August 8th, they had extended the tunnel 3 feet. They emerged exhausted, clothes caked with clay, and separated to return to their cabins before first light. Ruth had water ready for Moses. She washed the dirt from his hands without speaking. Their youngest child, sleeping on a pallet nearby, didn't stir. "How far?" Ruth whispered. 3 feet, Moses said. Ruth did the calculation. 200 feet to the property line, 3 feet per night, 66 nights. They had 63 nights until the sale. Moses saw the fear in her eyes. "We'll work faster," he said. But they both knew that faster meant riskier, meant noise that might carry, meant exhaustion that would show in their daytime work and draw Thorne's attention. The second night, they managed 4 feet. Jacob hit a seam of softer stone that yielded more easily, but William nearly passed out from lack of air. The tunnel was becoming long enough that oxygen didn't circulate properly. They needed ventilation. Moses spent the next day, Sunday, their half-day of rest, thinking about air shafts. He couldn't risk drilling upward. A hole in the pasture would be immediately visible. Instead, he fashioned a bellows from leather scraps and hollow reeds, creating a crude pump that could push fresh air into the tunnel. It helped, but not enough. By the end of the second week, they had advanced 23 feet. The tunnel now ran in near total darkness, lit only by candle stubs that burned the already thin air. The men developed a rhythm: strike, pry, load, carry, shore, repeat. Their hands blistered, then calloused, then split open and calloused again. Thomas lost a thumbnail when a rock pinned his hand against the tunnel wall. He wrapped it in cloth and kept digging. They told no one else yet. Moses wanted the tunnel at least halfway complete before expanding the circle of knowledge. Every additional person was a risk. But Ruth began preparing in small ways, mending clothes, saving food scraps, memorizing the route north from whispered stories she'd heard over the years. The thing about hope is it weighs more than fear. On August 21st, disaster nearly struck. Virgil Thorne was riding the property line on his horse, checking fence posts, when the animal suddenly balked and refused to move forward. Thorn dismounted and examined the ground. He saw nothing obvious, but horses sense voids beneath the surface. Thorn stood there for 5 minutes, scanning the ravine below, the tree line, the field beyond. Moses, working in that same field, watched this from 200 feet away. His blood went cold. If Thorn investigated the ravine, if he found fresh-turned earth, if he brought dogs. But after 5 minutes, Thorn remounted and continued his patrol. The horse stepped carefully, ears back, but moved forward. Thorn marked the location in his mind, but took no immediate action. He had more pressing concerns. The harvest was approaching, and labor needed to be focused there, not on phantom problems. Moses exhaled. That night, he and the others worked with renewed urgency. They advanced 6 feet, their best night yet. They were now 42 feet from the entrance, 1/5 of the way to the property line. By early September, the tunnel had reached 87 feet. Moses decided it was time to tell the others. He chose a Sunday afternoon when Thorn had ridden to town and Samuel Fairmont was visiting neighbors. The 11 people on the sale list were gathered quietly near the quarters, ostensibly to share a meal. Moses laid out the plan. They would leave on the night of October 14th. The trader was expected at noon on the 15th to take possession and begin the march to Richmond. By the time Fairmont discovered them missing, they would be 20 miles north, moving through the wilderness toward Fredericksburg and beyond. The reactions were mixed. Some, like Jacob's wife Hannah, who was on the sale list with her infant son, immediately agreed. Others, like an older man named Elijah, expressed doubt. Crawling through a tunnel in total darkness? Emerging into Virginia wilderness in October with no food, no money, no papers? And what happened to the people left behind? Fairmont would take his rage out on someone. Moses acknowledged the risks. But staying means the Deep South, means never seeing your families again, means cotton until your body breaks. A woman named Charity, 36, who was being sold with her 2 daughters, asked the crucial question. What about the children? Can they do it? The tunnel? Moses admitted he didn't know. They would have to carry the youngest. The older children would have to crawl. It would be slow, terrifying, claustrophobic, but possible. We have 4 weeks to finish, Moses said. And then we decide. Anyone who wants to stay, stays. No judgment. But anyone who wants to go, we take. 17 people ultimately committed. 11 from the sale list, plus 6 family members who would rather risk flight than separation. They included 8 adults, 7 children aged 4 to 13, and 2 infants. Over the next 2 weeks, these 17 became a conspiracy bound by silence. They prepared in ways invisible to the overseer and the owner. Ruth and the other women stole food in teaspoons. A handful of cornmeal here, a strip of dried meat there, amounts too small to notice but accumulating over weeks. The men fashioned crude packs from burlap and hide. Moses drew maps from memory, marking known roads, known patrols, known sympathizers, though the latter were rare in Spotsylvania County. The tunnel work intensified. They were now working 4 hours per night instead of 3, rotating diggers every 8 minutes instead of 10. Fatigue was becoming dangerous. William fell asleep standing up one morning while hoeing tobacco. Thorn noticed and administered 5 lashes as a warning. William took them without sound, but that night in the tunnel, he dug with fury that scared the others. By September 20th, they had reached 130 feet. They were 2/3 of the way to the property line. The tunnel was now long enough that hauling earth to the entrance took precious minutes. They created a relay system, passing sacks of clay hand to hand through the darkness. Then, on September 23rd, they hit water. A spring had seeped into the tunnel floor, creating a pool 6 inches deep. The water was ice cold and tasted of iron. It flowed from somewhere deeper in the limestone, following cracks they couldn't see. The digging became a muddy, miserable slog. Their candles sputtered in the damp air. The shoring boards swelled and shifted. Jacob, who'd worked in drainage ditches as a younger man, suggested they channel the water to one side using clay berms. It helped, but now they were working in freezing mud that numbed their hands and made every tool grip uncertain. Progress slowed. Some nights they managed only 2 feet. The mathematics were slipping away from them. October 14th was 3 weeks away, and they still had 50 feet to dig. Moses pushed harder. They began working 5 hours per night, then 6. The men's daytime labor suffered. Thorne noticed. He increased surveillance, riding past the quarters at odd hours, watching for signs of trouble. On October 1st, Ruth came to Moses with news that made his stomach drop. Samuel Fairmont had received a letter from the trader, Vance. The sale date had been moved up. Vance would arrive on October 12th, not October 15th. 3 days earlier. They had 11 nights to finish 50 feet of tunnel. Moses gathered the diggers that night and explained. They looked at each other in the candlelight, faces gaunt with exhaustion, hands wrapped in rags to protect the worst of the blisters. "We work in 2 shifts," Moses said. "Midday, when Thorne naps, we send 2 men down for an hour. At night, all 5 of us, 7 hours. Midday is suicide," Thomas said. "If we're caught, if we don't finish, we're sold." Moses cut him off. "Which do you prefer?" No one answered. They all knew. The next 10 days were a blur of desperation. Midday shifts were terrifying. Every sound from above might be Thorne's boots. Night shifts stretched until dawn, leaving them gray-faced and shaking. They were now eating the stored food themselves, needing the calories to keep digging. The tunnel advanced 5, 6, 7 feet per night. Boards cracked under the weight of earth above. Water pooled ankle-deep in places. They kept digging. On October 10th, Moses measured the tunnel at 184 feet. 16 feet to go. 2 nights remaining before the trader arrived. That night, working in what they hoped was the final push, Henry's pickaxe broke through into empty space. For a moment, they thought they'd hit another cave. Then they realized they'd reached the far side. They'd tunneled beneath the property line. Moses crawled to the opening and felt cool air rushing in. He scraped away more earth and saw stars. They'd done it. The tunnel was complete. They emerged at dawn on October 11th, 2 days before the sale, and stood in the oak forest on the far side of the county road. Free soil, or free enough. Moses allowed himself one moment of hope. Then he returned through the tunnel to tell the others. Tomorrow night, they would run. October 11th dawned gray and damp. Rain had fallen overnight, and the yard between the quarters and the big house had turned to red mud. Moses woke before first light and lay still on his pallet, listening to Ruth's breathing, to the children's soft snores. In 36 hours, they would either be free or dead. Ruth woke and met his eyes. She'd prepared as much as she could. Small bundles of food hidden in the cabin's walls, extra clothes sewn into inner layers, a knife wrapped in cloth and tucked into her bodice. They would carry the 2 youngest children. Sarah, 11, could walk. The middle child, Daniel, age 7, would have to be brave. The baby, not yet 2, would be strapped to Ruth's back. Moses spent the day working tobacco, moving through the rows with mechanical precision while his mind raced through logistics. 17 people. The tunnel mouth was a quarter-mile from the quarters. They would move in 3 groups. The first group would navigate the tunnel and emerge on the far side, ready to help pull others through. The second group would enter once the first was clear. The third group would follow, with Moses coming last to cover their tracks. The tunnel itself was a different problem. 184 feet long, barely 3 feet wide, ceiling so low you had to crawl or crouch. No light except what candles they could carry. Water in places. Unstable shoring. Moses had timed his own transit. Crawling through took 12 minutes. But he was fast. Children would be slower. Frightened people would be slower. He calculated 90 minutes to move everyone through, plus 30 minutes to gather on the far side and begin the march north. They would leave at midnight. That gave them 6 hours of darkness to put distance between themselves and Fairmont before the alarm was raised at dawn. What would you do if your children's survival depended on crawling through darkness beneath the earth, knowing that above you, tons of soil pressed down on rotting boards and faith? Across the property, in the big house, Samuel Fairmont was making his own preparations. Charles Vance would arrive tomorrow afternoon with payment and transport. 12 people would be taken away. 9 adults, 3 children. The remaining workforce would be sufficient to work the reduced acreage Fairmont planned to cultivate next year. He'd negotiated a good price. His debts would be manageable. The plantation would survive another season. Fairmont reviewed the sale list one final time. Moses was not on it. Too valuable as a carpenter and too entrenched to risk selling. Ruth was not on it. She was the best cook in the county. But their daughter Sarah was, along with Jacob, Hannah and her infant, Thomas, William, and 6 others. Fairmont felt a twinge of something. Not quite guilt, but awareness that he was destroying families. He dismissed it. Property had no families, not in the legal sense. This was business. Virgil Thorne spent the day on routine patrol, checking fields, inspecting the quarters, noting everything in his mental ledger. He'd sensed something off all week. The workers were too quiet, too focused, too careful. Thorne had overseen enough plantations to recognize the signs of conspiracy, but he couldn't identify the specific threat. Running seemed unlikely. Where would they go? Rebellion seemed even less likely. These were not rebellious people. Still, he increased vigilance. That evening, he rode the property line again. His horse balked in the same place it had weeks earlier, near the ravine. Thorne dismounted and walked the area more carefully this time. He saw disturbed earth near the tree line. Old disturbance, covered with leaves, but present. He made a note to investigate tomorrow, after the trader's business was concluded. The delay would cost him everything. As sunset approached on October 11th, the 17 conspirators moved through their evening routines with excruciating normalcy. They ate their evening meal of cornmeal mush and pork scraps. They banked fires in their cabins. They spoke in low voices about nothing important, performing the pantomime of enslaved life one final time. Moses had distributed final instructions that afternoon through a series of brief encounters that looked like ordinary work interactions. Jacob understood he would lead the first group. Thomas would lead the second. Moses would bring the third. Each group of 5 or 6 people spaced to prevent tunnel crowding. Ruth packed their bundle with shaking hands. 3 days of food, flint and steel, the knife, a blanket. Everything had to fit in a small sack she could carry while managing the baby. She looked around the cabin. the only home her children had known, and felt a complex grief. This place had been prison, but it had also been shelter. They were leaving behind everything familiar for a darkness both literal and metaphorical. At 11 o'clock, people began moving. The children had been told they were going on a night journey, a secret adventure. The youngest didn't understand. The older ones knew enough to be frightened, but not enough to grasp the full stakes. Jacob and his group, 5 people including Hannah and her infant, moved first. They walked casually across the dark yard, then into the woods beyond, using a path that looked like it led to the privy. Once in the trees, they moved faster, navigating by moonlight to the ravine where the tunnel entrance lay hidden. Jacob pulled aside the brush covering and felt cool, earthy air rising from below. He lit a candle stub and descended into the passage. Hannah followed with the infant strapped to her chest. The others came behind, Charity and her 2 daughters, and Elijah, who'd finally been convinced by the image of his grandchildren being sold away from him. The tunnel swallowed them. Jacob crawled forward, candle held low to avoid hitting his head on the shoring boards. The ceiling pressed down. Water pooled in depressions. The passage seemed to narrow and elongate in the flickering light. Behind him, he heard Hannah's breathing, rapid and shallow. The infant made small whimpering sounds. 12 minutes became 15, then 20. Charity's younger daughter, aged 6, began crying softly. "Hush now," Charity whispered. "Almost through, almost to the other side." But the darkness played tricks. The tunnel seemed endless. Jacob's candle burned down to a nub. He lit a second from the first and kept crawling. His knees were raw. His back ached from the crouch. And then, ahead, he saw stars. The exit. Jacob pushed through the opening and emerged into the oak forest on the far side of the county road. Cold October air hit his face. He turned and helped pull Hannah through. Then the infant, then the others. 6 people standing in free territory, gasping and shaking. "Wait here," Jacob said. "Silent. The next group is coming." Back at the quarters, Thomas led the second group into the woods. This group was larger, 7 people including William, 2 women from the sale list, and 3 children. They reached the tunnel entrance and descended. Thomas moved faster than Jacob had, pushing the pace because they were behind schedule. But the tunnel had other ideas. Halfway through, one of the shoring boards creaked ominously. Thomas froze. He heard earth shifting above, felt a trickle of clay dust on his neck. "Keep moving," he whispered back to the others. "But steady. No sudden weight." They crawled forward. The board held. Thomas emerged on the far side and found Jacob waiting with the first group. 13 people now, huddled in the forest darkness. "Last group's coming," Thomas said. "Then we move." Moses brought the final group. Ruth with the baby, their 2 other children, and 3 others from the sale list. They moved through the woods at 11:45, 15 minutes behind schedule. Moses could see clouds gathering, obscuring the moon. Rain would help cover their tracks, but make the journey harder. They reached the tunnel entrance. Moses went first, carrying a candle and leading Daniel by the hand. Ruth followed with the baby and Sarah. The others came behind. The tunnel felt different this time. Moses couldn't identify why, but something had changed. The air seemed thicker. The shoring boards creaked more than usual. Maybe it was the rain seeping down from above. Maybe it was the cumulative stress of 17 people and weeks of excavation. Maybe it was just his fear giving shape to nothing. They were 30 feet in when they heard the first rumble. Not loud, just a deep vibration in the earth. like distant thunder. Moses stopped. Behind him, Ruth stopped. Everyone stopped. "Keep going," Moses said, but his voice was tight. They crawled forward. 40 feet, 50 feet, the midpoint of the tunnel, and then they heard it clearly. Hoofbeats above. Someone was riding across the pasture directly over the tunnel. Heavy hoofbeats, multiple horses. Moses's mind raced. Thorn on patrol? Impossible. He'd never patrol this late. Fairmont returning from somewhere? Equally unlikely. Then he understood. The trader had arrived early, Vance and his men riding to the plantation in darkness to get an early start on the sale. 3 or 4 horses, judging by the sound, carrying men who weighed 150 to 200 pounds each. Maybe 600 pounds of horseflesh and humanity passing over a tunnel supported by boards that were already stressed to their limit. Moses heard the creaking intensify, heard wood splintering, heard Ruth behind him start to say something, but the sound was drowned out by a crack like a rifle shot. The ceiling gave way, not all at once. The collapse started at the weakest point, the section where they'd hit water, where the boards had swollen and weakened. A 6-foot section of tunnel ceiling fell in a cascade of clay and limestone. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Dust filled the air. The candle went out. Moses felt the shock wave of impact, felt earth rain down on his back, heard screaming behind him, Ruth's voice, Sarah's voice, others. He scrambled forward in total darkness, hands scrabbling on wet earth. He reached back and found Daniel's arm, pulled the boy forward. "Ruth!" he shouted. "Ruth!" No answer, just the sound of earth still falling. The tunnel behind him had collapsed completely. Moses made a decision born of desperation. He pushed forward, dragging Daniel, crawling through darkness toward where the exit had to be. His hands hit water. His head struck a low board. He kept moving. The tunnel narrowed. He squeezed through a gap that scraped skin from his shoulders, and then he was out. Night air, forest. Daniel beside him, coughing and crying but alive. Moses turned back to the tunnel entrance. It was partially blocked. He could hear nothing from inside. He started to crawl back in, but Jacob grabbed him. "You'll bring down more," Jacob said. "You'll kill yourself." Moses tried to fight him, but Jacob was stronger, and Thomas helped hold him. "Ruth," Moses said. "The baby. Sarah. There." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Behind them, through the trees, they could hear shouting from the plantation. Lanterns appeared in the big house windows. The horses had alerted someone. The collapse had been felt or heard. Men would be coming. Virgil Thorne had been in his cottage when he heard the rumble. He'd been reviewing ledgers by lamplight, and for a moment he thought the sound was thunder. Then he felt the vibration through the floor and knew it was something else. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside. Charles Vance and his men had just dismounted in front of the big house. They'd felt the horses stumble, heard the ground give way beneath hooves. Vance, a veteran of plantation transactions who'd seen every kind of trouble, immediately suspected an escape attempt. "Get lights," he shouted to his men. "Check the quarters." Samuel Fairmont emerged from the house in his nightshirt, confused and alarmed. "What's happening?" "Don't know yet," Thorne said. He was already moving toward the pasture where the horses had balked. He carried a lantern and the rifle. Behind him came Vance and 3 of his men, all armed. They reached the spot where the ground had collapsed, a depression 10 feet across, maybe 3 feet deep. The lantern light revealed broken boards, exposed clay, and something else, tool marks. This wasn't natural subsidence. This was excavation. Tunnel, Vance said. He'd seen this once before in Kentucky. Someone was digging out. Thorne felt cold rage settle over him. While he'd been watching for obvious signs of rebellion, they'd been digging beneath his feet. He should have investigated weeks ago when the horse first balked. He should have trusted his instincts. "Check the quarters," he said to Vance's men. "Count heads. I want to know who's missing." The men moved off. Thorne and Vance remained at the collapse site, examining it by lantern light. The tunnel had been sophisticated, shored with boards, angled downward into the limestone, then west toward the county road. Someone had engineering knowledge. Someone had planned this for weeks, maybe months. Vance's men returned within 20 minutes. 12 missing from the quarters, one reported. All from the sale list, plus 5 others, 17 total. Fairmont, who'd arrived dressed and frantic, went pale. 17? My God, how far could they get? "Depends when they left," Vance said. He knelt at the collapsed section and brushed away dirt. His hand came back wet with something dark. He held it to the lantern. Blood. Fresh. "Some didn't make it out," Vance said quietly. Thorne was already calculating. 17 people attempting to crawl through a tunnel 200 feet long. Maybe half made it through before the collapse. Maybe fewer. The ones who made it out had maybe a 30-minute head start, and they'd be slowed by children and darkness. "We need dogs," Thorne said. "And riders." They went west through the tunnel. "They'll be in the oak forest heading north." Fairmont was pacing. "The loss, the financial loss. Vance, our agreement." "Is void if the property can't be delivered," Vance said coldly. "My men and I will help with retrieval. Standard rate. $100 per recovered person, dead or alive." Thorne looked at him sharply. "Dead? They'll fetch less. But plantation labor in Alabama isn't particular about scars or disposition," Vance said. "And I'd rather have a corpse to sell than nothing at all." The hunt was on. In the collapsed tunnel, Ruth had maybe 60 seconds of consciousness after the ceiling came down. She felt weight pressing on her chest, forcing air from her lungs. Felt the baby crushed against her. Felt Sarah's hand gripping her arm. She tried to move, tried to dig, but the clay was too heavy, too dense. The last thing she heard was Sarah calling for Moses, then darkness took her. Sarah, 11 years old, was partially protected by her mother's body. The collapse had created a small air pocket, maybe 3 feet across, 2 feet high. She could breathe, she could move her arms, but she was trapped. She called for help. Her voice echoed in the confined space. She heard nothing back except the settling of earth and the distant sound of water dripping. She didn't know her mother was dead. She didn't know the baby was dead. She only knew she was alone in darkness beneath tons of soil. Above, Thorne organized the hunt with military efficiency. He sent 2 men on horseback west along the county road with lanterns and dogs. He sent 2 more north toward Fredericksburg to watch the main roads. He kept Vance's remaining man at the plantation to guard the collapse site and prevent anyone from attempting to dig out survivors. Then he returned to the quarters with Fairmont and began interrogations. The people who'd been left behind, 26 men, women, and children, huddled in their cabins and said nothing. Thorne went door to door, dragging people out, demanding answers. Who organized it? Who dug the tunnel? When did they leave? No one spoke. Even under threat, even with Thorne's cane rising and falling, they maintained silence. This was the final gift they could give the 17 who'd run. Buy them time with silence. Thorn broke a woman's arm trying to force answers. She screamed but said nothing. He threatened to sell children. Parents stared at him with eyes that held nothing but hatred. He was getting nowhere. Fairmont, watching this, felt something crack inside him. His property was destroying itself. His wealth was running into the darkness. His reputation would be ruined. The planter who couldn't control his own people. He walked back to the big house and opened a bottle of whiskey at 3 a.m. In the oak forest, Moses and the 12 who'd escaped crouched in a ravine, trying to decide what to do. Jacob wanted to keep moving north. Thomas wanted to go back, try to dig out the others. Moses couldn't think at all. His mind kept circling back to Ruth's voice calling his name, to the baby's weight against his chest that he'd never feel again, to Sarah, who he'd failed to protect. "We have to move," Jacob said. "The dogs are coming. If we stay, we all get caught." Moses looked at him. "My wife is dead. My daughter's buried alive. You want me to just run?" "What else can you do?" Jacob said, not unkindly. "If you go back, you die. If you stay here, you get caught. Ruth would want you to save Daniel. You know she would." Moses looked at his son, 7 years old, shivering in the cold, not understanding why his mother wasn't here, and he made the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We move north," he said. They left the ravine at 3:30 in the morning and began the desperate flight toward Fredericksburg. Behind them, dogs were already on the scent. Ahead lay 40 miles of hostile territory before they reached anything resembling safety. They had no chance. They ran anyway. The dogs found the trail within an hour. Thorne's men had borrowed hounds from a neighboring plantation, animals trained to track runaways through Virginia woods. The dogs picked up the scent at the tunnel's western exit and followed it north through the oak forest, baying in the pre-dawn darkness. Moses heard them at 4:15 in the morning. The sound carried through the trees, clear and terrible. He looked back at the 12 people with him, Daniel clinging to his hand, Jacob carrying Hannah's infant, Charity half dragging her exhausted daughters, Elijah and William and Thomas bringing up the rear. They'd covered maybe 3 miles. The dogs were closing. "Split up," Moses said. "Groups of 2 or 3, different directions. They can't follow everyone." Jacob shook his head. "They'll track the largest group. We stay together, we're caught together. We split, some might make it." They argued in frantic whispers while the baying grew louder. Finally, Jacob agreed. They divided into 4 groups. Moses took Daniel and headed northeast toward the Rappahannock. Jacob took Hannah and the infant northwest. Thomas and William went due north. Charity, her daughters, and Elijah continued straight ahead. The dogs, when they reached the split, paused. The hounds circled, confused by multiple scent trails. Thorne, riding behind them, made a quick decision. He sent half his men after the largest group, Charity's. The other half followed Jacob's trail. Moses and the others were left to the chance of additional patrols. Moses ran with Daniel through underbrush that tore at their clothes and skin. The boy was flagging, stumbling. Moses picked him up and carried him, feeling his own strength drain with each step. Behind them, the eastern sky was beginning to pale. Dawn would expose them completely. They reached the Rappahannock at 5:30, just as full daylight arrived. The river was running high from October rains, brown and fast. Moses looked for a crossing, a fallen tree, a shallow ford, and saw nothing. The nearest bridge was 2 miles downstream, near a mill where people would already be waking for work. "Can you swim?" Moses asked Daniel. The boy shook his head. Moses felt despair settle over him like a physical weight. He couldn't swim either, not well enough to cross a flood-swollen river while carrying a child. They were trapped. He heard hoofbeats on the trail behind them, riders coming fast. Moses made a decision. He pushed Daniel into thick brush along the riverbank and covered him with leaves. "Stay here, don't move, don't make a sound. I'll draw them away." "Papa." "Do it," Moses said. Then he ran downstream, splashing through shallows, making himself visible to the riders who were almost upon him. Virgil Thorne saw Moses break from the trees and spurred his horse forward. He'd been riding for 5 hours, cold and furious, and here finally was one of the ringleaders. He closed the distance in seconds, his horse splashing through the river shallows. Moses tried to dodge into deeper water, but Thorne caught him with a rope loop that settled around his shoulders and jerked tight. Moses went down hard. Thorne dismounted and stood over him, breathing heavily. "Where are the others?" Thorne demanded. Moses said nothing. Thorne kicked him in the ribs. "I asked you a question." Still nothing. Moses had made his calculation. He could take this beating. He could give Daniel time to stay hidden, to maybe be found by someone else. The boy was small enough to pass for an orphan, quick enough to learn a new story. Moses could buy that chance with silence. Thorne administered a brutal interrogation there on the riverbank. He used his boots, his cane, his fists. He broke Moses's left arm. He cracked ribs. He demanded names, routes, accomplices. Moses gave him nothing. Finally, Thorne gave up. "Tie him," he told his men. They bound Moses's hands and feet and threw him across a horse like cargo. They would take him back to Fairmont and let the trader decide his fate. Damaged goods were worth less, but some value was better than none. By mid-morning, the other groups had been caught as well. Charity and her daughters were run down in a cornfield 5 miles north. The dogs cornered them against a rail fence. Charity tried to fight with a stick broken from a tree, but Vance's men simply waited until she exhausted herself, then took her and the children at gunpoint. Jacob, Hannah, and the infant made it furthest, nearly 8 miles before doubling back accidentally and running into a patrol on the county road. They were captured without violence, too exhausted to resist. Thomas and William were found hiding in a tobacco barn at 6:30 in the morning. The barn's owner, a small farmer who worked his own land, saw them enter at dawn. He could have said nothing. Instead, he rode to the nearest plantation and reported the fugitives. He collected a $20 reward. By noon on October 12th, all 12 survivors were back at Fairmont Plantation, locked in the corn crib with armed guards posted outside. They were bruised, bleeding, defeated, but alive. Moses asked about Daniel. No one had seen a child matching his description. Hope flickered in Moses's chest. Maybe the boy had stayed hidden. Maybe someone kind had found him. Maybe. In fact, Daniel had emerged from the brush an hour after Moses was taken and wandered downstream, crying and lost. He was found by a Methodist minister traveling to church. The minister saw a terrified child with no papers and no family, and made the calculation that many made in Virginia in 1859. A stray enslaved child represented property that someone had lost. He took Daniel to the county sheriff. By evening, Daniel was back at Fairmont, reunited with his father in the corn crib. Moses held his son and wept. While the captured were being returned, Samuel Fairmont faced a different crisis. The tunnel collapse had created an instability in his pasture. During the morning, as horses and men crossed the area repeatedly, additional sections began to sink. By afternoon, a second collapse had opened a pit 15 feet across. Fairmont stood at the edge with Thorne and Vance, looking down into the exposed tunnel. They could see shoring boards, disturbed earth, and in one section, something that made even Vance turn away. A small hand, protruding from packed clay. "How many died in there?" Fairmont asked. "At least 5, Thorne said. He'd done the count. 17 fled, 12 captured, 5 unaccounted for. Probably more. The tunnel could have partial collapses further along." Fairmont felt sick. Not from moral horror. He'd been raised to see enslaved people as property, not humans, but from financial loss and social catastrophe. 5 dead meant 5 he couldn't sell, and the scandal would be enormous. The neighboring planters would hear about this. His creditors would hear. Everyone would know that Samuel Fairmont had lost control of his property so completely that they dug a tunnel beneath his feet. "What do we do with the tunnel?" Fairmont asked. Vance lit a cigar and considered. "Fill it. Salt the earth. Make sure nothing grows there, and never speak of it again." "The bodies, leave them," Vance said flatly. "Digging them out might collapse more tunnel. And frankly, Mr. Fairmont, you can't afford the labor cost of excavation. Cut your losses." Thorne agreed. "We fill it tonight. Bring in every available hand. By morning, this looks like a sinkhole that we repaired. Nothing more." Fairmont nodded slowly. It was the practical solution. The cold solution. The solution that erased evidence of his humiliation. "Do it," he said. That night, the enslaved people who'd been left behind were forced to fill their friend's grave. They hauled cartloads of clay and stone to the collapsed tunnel. They shoveled earth into the pit, while Thorne watched with rifle in hand. They worked by torchlight, their faces blank with grief and fury. Some tried to dig carefully near where the hand had been visible, hoping to extract bodies for proper burial. Thorne stopped them. "Fill it," he ordered. "All of it. Now." They filled it. They buried Ruth and the baby and Sarah and the other 2 who died in the collapse. They buried the tunnel that had represented their hope. They buried the evidence of their rebellion, and with every shovelful of earth, they cursed Samuel Fairmont and Virgil Thorne and every white man who'd turned them into mathematics and property. By dawn on October 13th, the pasture looked ordinary again. The tunnel was gone. The bodies were sealed beneath 20 feet of clay and stone. The story was being rewritten into something manageable. A failed escape attempt, swiftly crushed, order restored. Charles Vance left Fairmont Plantation on October 14th with what remained of his purchase. He'd renegotiated with Fairmont. The original 12 on the sale list were now reduced to 7. 5 had died in the tunnel. Of the 12 who'd been captured, Vance agreed to take the 5 who were on his original list and were still in sellable condition. Moses was not among them. His broken arm and cracked ribs had reduced his value too much. Fairmont decided to keep him, to heal him, and to use him as an example. Moses would work Fairmont land for the rest of his life, a living reminder of what happened to those who resisted. Daniel was sold separately to a Richmond trader specializing in child labor. He was 7 years old. Moses watched his last child taken away in a wagon and felt something fundamental break inside him that would never heal. The sale netted Fairmont $3,200, less than half what he'd expected. It wasn't enough to clear his debts. Within a year, Fairmont would be forced to sell the plantation entirely and move to Richmond to work as a clerk. The property would change hands 3 times over the next decade, each owner noting in their journals that the north pasture had poor drainage and wouldn't grow crops properly. Virgil Thorne stayed on through the sale, then moved to a plantation in Georgia. He would die in 1864, shot by a Union soldier during Sherman's march. His last words, recorded by a field surgeon, were complaints about the quality of the labor he'd overseen throughout his career. The enslaved people who'd remained at Fairmont never spoke openly about the tunnel again. But among themselves, in whispers, they kept the story alive. They told their children about the night Moses and the others tried to dig to freedom, about the collapse that killed 5, about the courage it took to crawl through darkness beneath tons of earth. And they told one other thing. On certain nights, when the wind was right and the moon was dark, you could hear sounds from beneath the north pasture. Scraping, digging, a child's voice calling for her father. The white owners, who came after Fairmont, dismissed these as superstitious stories told by ignorant people. But the sounds continued, generation after generation, until local farmers learned to avoid that section of land entirely. Moses lived another 31 years. He saw the Civil War come and go. He saw emancipation arrive in 1865, transforming him legally from property to person. He saw Reconstruction rise and fall, and through all of it, he carried the weight of October 11th, 1859. After the war, Moses stayed in Spotsylvania County. He had nowhere else to go. He worked as a paid laborer on various farms, saving money slowly. He asked every traveling minister, every circuit rider, every black person passing through if they'd heard news of a boy named Daniel, sold to Richmond in 1859. No one had. He never remarried. He lived in a small cabin on land that had once been part of the Fairmont plantation, now subdivided and sold to small farmers. On clear nights, he would walk to the north pasture, the place where the tunnel had collapsed, and stand there in silence. People in the black community knew who he was. They knew the story, passed down through families who'd been present that night. Some saw him as a hero who'd tried to lead people to freedom. Others saw him as a man who'd caused 5 deaths through recklessness. Moses saw himself as something simpler, a husband and father who'd failed everyone he loved. In 1873, a black Baptist minister named Josiah Freeman came to Spotsylvania County to establish a church. Freeman had been born enslaved in Maryland, but educated after the war. He sought out Moses and asked if he would share his story for a history Freeman was compiling of resistance during slavery. Moses, now 68 years old, told Freeman everything: the planning, the digging, the collapse, the capture. Freeman recorded it in meticulous detail. He asked Moses if he felt it had been worth it. 12 people lived, Moses said. 5 died. Daniel was sold away. Ruth and the baby died in my arms. Was it worth it? He paused. I still don't know the answer. Freeman's history was never published. He died in 1876, and his papers were scattered. But portions survived, including Moses's testimony, which ended up in a Richmond Historical Society's archives. Moses himself died in 1890 at age 85. He was buried in the Black Cemetery outside Spotsylvania Courthouse. His grave marker, paid for by the community, read simply, Moses, he led us toward freedom. When the surveyors broke through into the tunnel in 1897, they found it largely intact. The collapse had been localized to 2 sections. The rest of the passage remained, a memorial in clay and limestone to desperate hope. They found 11 skeletons. Ruth, the baby, Sarah, and 2 others who'd been in the 3rd group. All had died from crushing injuries or asphyxiation. Their bodies had been mummified by the dry limestone conditions, preserved in the positions they'd died. reaching forward, hands clawing at earth. The surveyors reported their discovery to the county coroner. A cursory investigation was conducted. The coroner concluded it was an old incident, probably from the slavery era, of no current legal concern. The remains were buried in the potter's field, but the story spread. Newspapers picked it up. "Tunnel of Death found beneath old plantation," read one headline. "11 slaves died seeking freedom," read another. The articles were brief and factual, with no mention of names or context. Josiah Freeman's widow, hearing about the discovery, provided his notes to a black newspaper in Richmond. That paper published Moses's full testimony in March of 1898. It created a small sensation in black communities across Virginia. Here was documented proof that resistance had taken forms more complex than rebellion or flight, that people had literally tried to tunnel their way to freedom. White historians largely ignored the story. It didn't fit their narratives of the Civil War as the great watershed, or of slavery as a system where contentment reigned until abolitionist agitation arrived from the North. A tunnel dug in darkness by desperate people complicated those stories. But in black oral tradition, the tunnel became legend. It was taught in churches and community halls. It was referenced in sermons about perseverance. It became a counter-narrative to the dominant history that erased black agency. And on the site itself, something else emerged. The North Pasture, where surveyors had disturbed the earth, became a place of pilgrimage. Black families would visit on the anniversary of October 11th. They would leave flowers, sing hymns, tell the story to their children. The property's white owners found this disturbing. They posted "no trespassing" signs. When those were ignored, they built fences. When the fences were climbed, they threatened legal action. Eventually, they sold the property to a development company that planned to build a railroad depot. But the depot was never built. Workers reported strange occurrences: tools disappearing, equipment malfunctioning, sounds from underground that made horses refuse to work. The development company abandoned the project in 1903, citing unforeseen complications. The land sat empty for decades. It changed hands repeatedly, but no one successfully developed it. Local farmers whispered that it was cursed, that Moses had put a hex on it, that the 5 who died wouldn't rest. The truth was simpler and stranger. The tunnel had created instabilities in the bedrock that made construction dangerous. The limestone was riddled with voids and fractures from the excavation. The land was literally unstable, undermined by hope. In 1968, a black community organization purchased the North Pasture and surrounding land. They established it as a memorial park dedicated to resistance during slavery. They erected a simple marker. In October 1859, 17 enslaved people attempted to tunnel to freedom from this site. 5 died in the attempt. 12 were captured and sold. Their courage is not forgotten. The park hosts an annual gathering every October 11th. Descendants of the families involved come from across the country. They tell the story again. They remember the names: Moses, Ruth, Sarah, Jacob, Hannah, Charity, Thomas, William, Henry, Elijah, and the others whose names were lost to time. And on still August nights, when humidity presses down and the earth holds heat like a memory, people walking near the old pasture sometimes report a sound rising from beneath the soil, rhythmic, deliberate, like tools striking stone, like desperate hands digging toward a freedom that waits just beyond reach. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.